Depth Mystic Community Podcast, episode 27. Depth Mystic Community Podcast, episode 27. So we're probably just going to settle in on this theme song. It was made to be like the title screen of the mystical video game. But it's a really good theme song, and I think we'll just settle for that one. With me, as always, Jungian Depth Mystic Zach Tollen. Hello. What's going on? Actually, I sort of know what's going on. So somebody asked me, what is the most important thing in Jungian psychology? Well, that's kind of too big of a question to ask. I suppose there is some subjectivity involved in the answer. Yeah, there is, but you do have an opinion, right? Well, of course, I'm going to have my opinion. Obviously, the thing that's most important for a given person is going to change depending on the circumstances. I think it's still a valid question. What about Jungian psychology is going to have the most impact in general? Yes, I don't know what other people who care about Jungian psychology would say, but my answer is that it has to do with the evolution of religious history, or the evolution of religion throughout history. That's a huge topic. I mean, that's something very few people even talk about nowadays. And I think we've talked about that a little bit in other episodes, but go on. So the most important thing about Jungian psychology is that it is, in my opinion, an evolution of Christianity. And one of the ways to describe this evolution is to recognize that Christianity has always identified itself with the Trinity. It's one God, but it's three gods. It's the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. But they've really staked their claim on the Trinity as a thing. That's true about Christianity. I mean, it's obviously the Catholic Church's position. And ever since the Protestant Reformation, various heresies have gone their own way and done their own thing. But it is a very weird hybrid between monotheism and polytheism that Christianity adopts. And the other monotheisms do not adopt this. You know, Judaism is just monotheistic, and Islam is just monotheistic. Christianity, although technically a monotheism, has this weird three gods in one God kind of arrangement. Yes, Carl Jung discusses a psychological interpretation of the Trinity. He wrote an essay called A Psychological Interpretation of the Dogma of the Trinity. And the point is, he actually has a way of understanding how human beings develop from birth, you know, as an infant, and then develop this sort of relationship between three parts of themselves. But yeah, Christianity really cares about this three-part thing. So the Father is like the creator God, the creator of all things. But then the Son is kind of a reflection of the Father's passionate interest in humanity. So he turns himself into a person in order to experience personhood while maintaining his godlike nature. And then he dies and is risen from the dead, ascends into heaven, and then sends the third part of God, which is the Holy Spirit, which is, from my perspective, it's the most interesting part because it's the only part we still have access to. Like, the creation already exists. And Jesus, the man, came and went, as far as I can tell. But the Holy Spirit is the thing that's still here with us. At least that's how I look at it. And so I think that's the most interesting part. And in official Catholic doctrine, they're all God. Each one is fully God. None of them loses their capacity for being God just because the others are also God. The church prefers that paradox rather than succumbing, as it were, to a logical analysis with regard to how a thing can be one thing and three things at the same time. And this is the whole 2,000-year era of Christianity has centered the focus on the Trinity. So the question is like, what is the most important thing in Jungian psychology? And I guess it has something to do with that, if you're spending so much time talking about it. Yeah, it does. Carl Jung paid very close attention to symbolic events. And one of the most important symbolic events that's happened, and according to Jung, it was the most important event in the last 500 years. He says the Protestant Reformation was the last event that was as important as this event. And it's a strange event. It's called the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, the dogma of the Assumption. Now, the actual doctrine that Mary, the Virgin Mother of Jesus, died and was assumed bodily into heaven in a sort of special miracle, this has been believed for at least 1,000 years. And the significance of it increased. You know, they don't claim to worship Mary, but they praise her and adore her. They do something like worshiping that is not officially worshiping because that would make them idolaters. But the idea of Mary is a big deal. And the Catholic dogma is the unshakable opinions of the Catholic Church. Catholics has many different opinions, and they have many different levels of authority. And dogma is the highest level of authority. And so basically after 1,000 years of the Virgin Mary becoming more and more important to Catholics, they finally declared the dogma in 1950. They finally made it the official, unshakable doctrine of the church that Mary was assumed bodily into heaven. And it's kind of a weird thing to talk about, especially when you realize Carl Jung considered that the most important religious event since the Protestant Reformation in 1521. And I guess the reasoning is obviously going to be hard to figure out. It's not like anybody really talks about the dogma of the Assumption as a significant historical or religious event. So we're in a weird situation. But effectively what it means is that they threw a woman in there. Basically up in heaven there was the Father and the Son, and the Holy Spirit was kind of, everywhere. But it was in heaven, so you have this heavenly Trinity. But it's a little bit scandalous. They don't admit it. The church doesn't admit the implications of the things that they say and believe. Anything that's inconvenient for the church hierarchy will be downplayed. But the fact that you now have a woman up there in heaven, and they use things like she's in the heavenly bridal chamber, which is to say she's getting married to Jesus. It's a kind of like divine incest that's been part of religion for, even in the Egyptian times, there was a kind of privilege of the gods to engage in incest in a way that ordinary people are prohibited from. But the fact that there's a woman now sort of traipsing around, presumably, up in heaven is a huge deal. And Carl Jung really understood the psychological significance of it. Because now you're talking about a quaternity. You're talking about a four-person entity, no longer a trinity. And this is the symbolic expression of the new thing that religion is dealing with, the evolution of religion. Okay, so that's kind of amazing. Now talk about the idea of the quaternity, because doesn't it have its own separate thing going on? Yeah, historically and symbolically, the four-part entity is everywhere. It already had a life of its own. While Christianity tended to focus on the Trinity, the quaternity appears almost everywhere. In the four directions, north, south, east, west, for example, the four seasons, and the alchemical elements, earth, air, fire, and water. So this process of designating the four things, the four evangelists, even in Christianity, you have the four gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's a whole bunch of others that would be easy to identify. The four is a big deal in religious history. So that's a problem, because if the four is so new, if having a fourth part of the Godhead is so new, why is it also so old? Yeah, that's true. It's really old. I guess the bigger question is, what made the Trinity such a big deal? Why did Christianity make the three such a big deal? Since the four has been kind of like an archetype that's been with people since the beginning. I guess the emergence of the Trinity came about due to some of the conditions of the Roman Empire back when. It's as if there was a compelling need to have a God that was directional and was moving through time in a very intentional, purposeful way. The Trinity, it's like a triangle makes an arrow that points. A quaternity is like a square or a compass with a cross on it that is more like a circle and doesn't go anywhere. The archetype of the four has to do with eternity, whereas the Trinity has a directionality, a pointing in a direction, somewhere to go. But yeah, the four's been around forever. And now the religious issue is that the Trinity is kind of becoming a quaternity. The directional arrowhead of Christianity, it doesn't have the same places to go. It's gone far enough in its single direction. And the quaternity has to do with eternity, which is the ever-present nature of everything. We have to evolve into a way where we can just be where we are happily without thinking that there's some kind of dragon to slay somewhere else where we're going to focus all our energy on achieving some kind of long-term victory. Okay, we're getting a little lost, I think, in all this stuff. Eventually, I do want to get back to the original question. Why is this the most important thing in Jungian psychology? I guess you've answered that a little bit. But there's still a little bit more to discuss with regard to the nature of the relationship between 3 and 4. Yeah, so I think it's important to point out that the relationship between the archetype of 3 and the archetype of 4 has its own history. If you take 3 and you add 4, you get the number 7. And to me, the number 7, the power of the number 7 has to do with the fact that it symbolizes one relationship between 3 and 4. Whereas the number 12 symbolizes the other obvious relationship between 3 and 4. 3 times 4 is 12. And you notice these both in how we measure time. And so the archetypal history of the relationship between 3 and 4 goes back even into the Babylonian or Sumerian period when they first developed the timetables where they would divide the hour, the minute into sections of 60 and the day into sections of 24. They're all multiples of the multiplicative relationship between 3 and 4, which is 12. And we also have a 7-day week, which is 3 plus 4. So somehow people are always psychologically, at a deep level, without even knowing why, interested in how 3 relates to 4. And it's proven by the fact that we measure our time in units which reflect that relationship. Okay, that's really interesting. It's something ancient having to do with something modern. But it makes you wonder if the emergence of the 4 from the 3 is the most important thing in Jungian psychology, according to Jungian Depth Mystic Zach Tollen. Then are we just reverting back to the ancient times? Are we just going to now forget everything that happened? Because we already knew that there was a relationship. When we first created our time units, we embodied that relationship. I know, it's kind of funny. The archetype of eternity is sort of coming back. And that's actually hard to figure out because the actual experience of 4-dimensional consciousness, there's a Jungian author named Robert A. Johnson, and he talks about 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional, and 4-dimensional consciousness. And the emergence of 4-dimensional consciousness is actually the most advanced consciousness the world has ever known. It's sort of like you're a Jedi master. That's what being a Jungian depth mystic even is becoming a master of 4-dimensional consciousness as opposed to modern 3-dimensional consciousness. And so it is the forefront of consciousness, basically. It's inevitable that somebody would notice that there is a relationship between 3 and 4 that goes back to the dawn of history. The months, of course, are another example of 3 and 4, 12 signs in the zodiac. And these historically predated all of our monotheistic religion. They are pagan things. But the idea that the 4th person of the Trinity, as it were, would emerge now, it's a little mysterious. And I think we might have to go into it in terms of Jungian psychological types at a different point. Because Carl Jung noticed that there were 8 different major psychological types, and they each have a kind of polarity where they set up a 3 in opposition to their inferior function. And so they deal in the relationship of 3 and 4. It's a kind of balancing that Christianity has never needed. Christianity always had a mission. It always kind of had a quest. It always had a kind of purpose that it was leading towards. But finally, we start realizing that one person's purpose is diametrically opposed to another person's purpose if they have opposite types. And there's no resolution to that unless you find like the eternal balance between the types. Figuring out the balance between the energies of the psychological types, which is the emergence of the 4th person. I guess you just went into it a little bit. You just gave a little taste of the idea of why the 4th is important in terms of Jungian types. Yeah, essentially, the 4th person of the Trinity is emerging, and that raises up the relationship between 3 and 4, which has to do with the numbers 7 and 12. But it is also a kind of final place where consciousness arrives at. Christianity has always been restricted. Christianity has always been a half measure, at least in my opinion. I often call Christianity a kind of battlefield medicine. It's a way of rescuing people from total damnation. But it's not really a way of telling them how to live in heaven. Like, suppose they actually arrive at a good way to live. Christianity is a way of getting out of hell, but it's not, in my opinion, an explanation of how we can set up a sort of sustainable lifestyle here on Earth. We're going to need Jungian psychology to add into the mix. It's almost like you're just scratching the surface. But it's such a huge topic. I mean, if Jungian psychology is the study of the fourth person of the Trinity as an evolution of existing religion, then it's not going to be something you can cover in just one episode. Exactly. That'll do it for episode 27. Leave a comment in one of our discussion forums, and we'll see you next week.